I think it's natural to say you want Georgia to lose. You want them to come back to the pack a little bit. And I think we can look at that and we can have that discussion. But I've also said that typically you want to root for the conference. Now, that may be antiquated because nowadays there's just basically two conferences in the Big Ten and the Pac 12, or excuse me, the SEC. The Pac 12's long forgotten. So when I look at the SEC, I think they already have a dominant position. So I used to say root for the SEC. It makes the conference look better. To me, they're in this catbird seat anyway. So it doesn't hurt to root against SEC teams. It doesn't hurt if they falter whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, conference pride is that's a 30-year-old. I honestly think conference pride was on its way out the minute the BCS started, and then it was dead with the college football playoff. Because the point of conference pride, I always felt was, look, for the first 100 years of college football, the national champion was based on what poll voters determined. And you wanted your conference to have a certain level of prestige. So you could say we deserve to be number one if you're competing for the national championship at the end of the year based on the conference you played in. Well, I mean, AP and coaches poll had a little bit of a say in the BCS. Don't get me wrong. Actually, their say increased after 2003. But then the college football playoff started. And I think conference pride pretty much died by the wayside, particularly if you're in the SEC or the Big Ten at that point. And so I'm with you. I think it's much better for Tennessee if Georgia loses. I think that, it's Tennessee's going to have their first top 10 finish since 2001 at the end of this year. 2001 was Mark Richt's first year at Georgia. It's not a coincidence that Tennessee fell off as Georgia started to emerge again under Mark Richt for the first time post Vince Dooley. I mean, Tennessee really benefited from Georgia being a laughingstock program between Vince Dooley and Mark Richt. I think NIL money, we keep talking about how the NIL is such a factor with which schools have the most. I don't think that's going to be that big as big of a factor. I think it does help Tennessee. But I think the big thing with NIL is it's going to have smaller urban, let's say Division I, lesser tier schools in big cities with elite athletes might lure those athletes to stay home now. With some of the business leaders in those communities. I think of a school like Memphis, Memphis football, where Tennessee or Georgia or Alabama would go in and get the best players out of that city. And I think FedEx might just throw a ton of money at them to stay home and go play football for Memphis. And I actually think that NIL is going to create more parity in the future than
Certainly.
we have right now.
Yeah, certainly could see that because you don't have prospects or players that are sitting on the bench for 2 and 3 years. Now, I do believe that Alabama and Georgia are going to follow in this mold that players are going to be willing to sit there for a year or two because of what they see based on the history of players going on to the NFL. And I think a running back's very wise to sit out at Alabama for a year or two, knowing that he'll have more tread on his tires, get to that second contract in the NFL. However, if a guy's Alvin Kamara is a great example. He was at Alabama. He was not suited there, be it the tough discipline or he didn't like being there, never really got to the bottom of that story. I think he was both asked to leave and wanted to leave. But there's a great example. If he's sitting there, he did transfer, but there are a lot of guys that have sat through that have stayed at Alabama. Now, if you can go get $1 million, exactly like Alabama takes in the young man from Georgia Tech. If you can go make money, why would you not cruise off? Because now you can put your family in a financial position that they wouldn't be at if you sat there and waited on the NFL for 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. It's and you're right. It's not going to affect it's not like an either or feast or famine situation. It's not like Alabama and Georgia are going to just all of a sudden fall off the map because you're right. They're still going to have a certain number of players that they're still going to have a certain level of depth. But you're right, there will be some players that would have stayed that will now go to another school because of the $1 million that's offered at their hometown school or hometown program. And that's where you're going to start seeing the talent dispersed a little bit. And football is the game of injuries. And so, for the longest time, Alabama and Georgia has been this way recently. They can sustain injuries that NFL teams can't even sustain, given the level of depth and how much deeper they are than everybody else. And that's not going to happen in the future, I don't think. That doesn't, again, they're still going to be good. I think location and proximity to home for recruiting talent does matter. So I still think Georgia and LSU and Ohio State, I think those three schools you can fall out of bed and get a top 5 recruiting class in those 3 schools.